Welcome back, everyone. Professor Bannock here to talk to you about Immanuel Kant and the groundwork for the metaphysics of morals. Continuing on with book 2 or chapter 2 of Kant's groundwork. Kant's concern in the second groundwork is to give one principle from which all normative truths can be derived. Some normative statements are true, other normative statements are false, yet other normative statements have many conditions upon them. They're context sensitive to determine their truth. But where does the truth of normative statements come from? Notice, normative statements are distinct from laws of nature. Laws of nature are descriptions of the way the world actually proceeds. Laws of morality, on the other hand, are normative. That is to say, they say how things ought to proceed, even in fact if they do not proceed that way descriptively. And the ground for the kinds of things that we say about the natural world is given by laws of nature. So it seems like the ground of what we say about the world of morality should also be given by laws of morality that make normative statements true or false. Examples of laws of nature include things like every body has a mass and force equals mass times acceleration. These are descriptive truths. They tell us about how reality proceeds as a matter of fact in a descriptive fashion. But laws of morality, for example, like one ought not to kill or one ought to treat others with respect, these are plausible laws of morality, at least to begin with. These are normative. They don't describe the way the world actually goes. We could look out in the world and see plenty of exceptions to these. There are people that are killing out there, unfortunately. There are people, unfortunately, out there that do not treat others with respect. But no one can transgress the laws of nature. No one can disagree and go the other direction when it comes to F equals ma. There's no freedom in the laws of nature. Freedom is now here in our freedom to either obey the laws of morality or not do so. So the way the world actually is, the way we can look out and describe it, doesn't give us any ground for moral laws. And in fact, Kant laments that if we spend too much time trying to understand morality through example, through observation, we might fall away from our hope or our faith that morality is possible. We're going to see so many instances of going against the laws of morality that we might start to lose any faith that we could ever ground the laws of morality, that they have any purchase on reality at all. But we cannot, for Kant, find the ground of the laws of morality in the laws of nature. Moreover, if we're trying to find our freedom, freedom is not, for Kant, simply doing whatever it is that you like. Right now, I'm raising my hand up and down. I'm free to do that, but that's not freedom in the kind of sense Kant is after. Freedom is not freedom to do whatever it is you want, to determine your will in whatever direction. We won't know if we're free. We won't be able to have that self-conception if we're always following our desires, for example. If we let our will be determined by our desires, those desires could have been installed in us by nature. It could have been installed in us by our upbringing. And so it's really nature or our upbringing in that case that is determining us. That's what Kant will call heteronomy or other determination, being determined by something outside of oneself. Moreover, as long as we're part of this matrix or this manifold of nature, our bodies are going to be determined by something outside of ourselves. My brain or the other elements of my environment are causing my body to behave in particular ways. But freedom also doesn't simply mean violating the laws of nature or violating the laws of causality. That would just be random. In order to violate the laws of causality, I would have no ability to determine my will at all. It would just have to go in some random direction. So it's not pure randomness that we're after when we're looking for freedom. Rather, for Kant, the idea is that the free will is the one that gives the laws of morality to itself, that obeys the moral law solely for the sake of the law, not because someone else is telling them to do it, not because nature has implanted an instinct in us to do it, but solely because It is the moral law. So the laws of morality are actually constitutive of our freedom. Freedom is self-bondage. It's giving the law to myself. Everyone else giving the laws to themselves. So it's only by acting from the duty of the moral law that we come to recover our true being. Do we have ethical obligations? Are there statements of laws of morality that are true or false? Kant will say yes, and where do they come from? They come from pure reason alone, not from nature, not from God, but simply from the very idea of a will that is not determined by anything else, and a will that does not conflict with itself, a will that is totally lawful and totally constitutive of its own agency. Now, as we said before, Kant's goal in Groundwork 2 is to show the ground for the truth of imperatives. Now, imperatives are commands of the form, you ought to do something. So they're in the domain of our freedom. Laws of nature cannot give grounds for the truth of ought statements like these. So where are the grounds of the truth of ought statements? Kant is going to say some ought statements are categorically true, and that's Kant's real concern. Other ought statements are only contextually or hypothetically true. There's lots of conditions in place on them, and they receive their truth from the facts of the matter with respect to those conditions. So here are some examples. These are various imperatives. I ought to study for the exam. You ought to treat others with respect. You ought to practice swimming, and so on and so forth. Notice, I can give myself imperatives, or others can give imperatives indeed to others. Notice that this phrase ought to, in all cases, gives these different sentences a similar form. In each case, we have an ought followed by the content of that ought. You ought to study the exam, you ought to treat others with respect, and so on. That indicates to you that whatever follows the ought is an obligation, that is, a moral or practical necessity, not a necessity like the necessities of gravity or something that cannot be transgressed. These are necessities, but only in the sense that they're obligations, not in the sense that you will do it, but that you must do it or that you should do it. I ought to study for the exam. That seems true. But if you don't have an exam, it's not true. So this is going to be one of those kinds of imperatives that's context-based, differs for the individual. If you're not taking a class, then you have no obligations to study for the exam. So what makes this true is going to vary by individual, and it's going to depend on a lot of circumstances. Suppose you are a student and you have an exam coming up, but you don't want to do well. You're there just to fail. Now, it's not clear why someone would do that, but we can conceive of such a situation. Well, in that case, this is not even true for them. Having the obligation to study for the exam is contingent upon being in a class where there's an exam coming up. It's contingent upon your desire to do well in the class. Similarly with this one down here, you ought to practice swimming. If you have no desire to swim, this obligation doesn't apply to you. In what cases would such an obligation apply to you? Well, if you were on a water polo team and you wanted to do well, then you have an obligation to practice swimming. And if you're not practicing, then you're failing in an obligation. Now, that's a practical necessity. It's not necessarily a moral necessity. Similarly with studying for the exam. If you fail to study for your exam, that doesn't make you a morally bad person. It just means you didn't fulfill an obligation that you had due to some kind of role that you played in society, or due to some kind of goal that you set for yourself. Now, this second one, though, seems a little bit different. You ought to treat others with respect. It seems wrong to say that this imperative applies to you only if you, say, want to be nice to others. This is the kind of imperative that Kant is primarily interested in, the kind of imperative that applies universally. And he thinks that universal application is what sets out a moral imperative or an ethical imperative from the other kinds of imperatives. This middle one, you ought to treat others with respect, is for Kant an ethical imperative because there are no exceptions to it. There are no additional conditions on it. So if there are no conditions on it, where's the truth of it come from? That's Kant's big question. That's what we're going to look at in the remainder of the video. What makes this normative necessity, this kind of moral necessity, true or false? It certainly isn't the laws of nature. It's certainly compatible with the laws of nature to treat others with disrespect. So we need a different ground for this kind of normative truth, distinct from the laws of nature. Well, that means we're going to have to come to a self-understanding as beings who are kind of straddling the line between being part of nature but also having the capacity to rise to being free beings, to rise to a self-understanding as a moral being under the laws of the intelligible world and not merely the appearance world. So Kant divides the imperatives into two different categories. The first category that we'll consider right now is the hypothetical imperatives. These have the form of if something, then you ought to do something. So these issue in normative ought statements only given a prior condition. So if you want to get an A, then you ought to study for the exam. If this condition does not apply to you, then the imperative does not apply to you. If you want to be a water polo player, then you ought to practice swimming. Now, what makes these imperatives true? Well, it's something about the conditions, right? Getting an A, being a good student involves studying. So it's because of the concept of being a student that studying follows of normative necessity from your desire to be a good student. Similarly, water polo playing involves swimming. So the necessity of practicing swimming, if you want to be a water polo player, comes from the demands of water polo. So the truth or falsity of hypothetical imperatives, whether they apply to an individual case or not, has their grounds in the specific concepts involved. So Kant divides the hypothetical imperatives. Remember, those are the ones that only apply if given constraints or conditions apply, into imperatives of skill and imperatives of virtue. If there's a skill that you want to develop, being a good student or water polo playing or playing the guitar, then there are well-established means to those ends written into the end, right? Part of being a good guitar player is learning the chords on a guitar. That's a means to the end of developing the skill of playing guitar. Those imperatives, like learn your chords if you're playing the guitar, are imperatives of skill. It's just part of what the nature of playing guitar is like. In general, the understanding of hypothetical imperatives comes from our ability of instrumental practical reasoning. Instrumental practical reasoning is means-ends reasoning. And it's very important that Kant places instrumental practical reasoning over here, because remember Aristotle, for example. For Aristotle, all practical reason is instrumental in the sense that it's means to ends. We have an end, something that we want to accomplish, a skill or something, and then we calculate about the means to get to that end. What instrument can we use to obtain our goal? Instrumental practical reasoning. And if we look at Aristotle, all reasoning about ethics is instrumental practical reasoning. It's means to the ends of happiness. The wise or prudent person for Aristotle is the one who understands the right ends to aim for and understands how to carry out the means to those ends. The morally wise person for Aristotle is the person who has this skill of instrumental practical reasoning. Those are the traditions of ethics that Kant is going against. Kant is going to say that there's also a space of pure practical reason, that is reasoning about what we should do, totally divorced from means ends instrumental reasoning. That brings us to the idea of a categorical imperative. That is, imperatives that we ought to do, things we know we ought to do, that we can come to know we ought to do, not because we've reasoned our way through the means to some end, but simply because having a self-consistent free will depends on it.